Hi, everyone. My name is David Roach, an attorney with the Environmental Law Institute, and I'll be the moderator today. Welcome to the very first official installment of our new webinar series, the Environmental Accountability Project. A lot of you may remember this as the Ocean Seminar Series, and we'll still be focusing mostly on ocean and coastal issues, but we're also going to pivot a little bit to talk about some terrestrial issues and global issues as well as the political winds are shifting. So, like politics nowadays, it promises to be a very interesting ride. So consider yourselves all the very first people to test a new roller coaster design or something similarly exciting. Fortunately for this pilot webinar, we have a fascinating and diverse group of panelists and a similarly amazing mix of attendees from law, policy, government, and the press, along with some private citizens that are trying to stay engaged. At this point, we have almost 200 people registered, so you have lots of company that clicked on the link and are interested in this subject. So before we get to the presentations, I want to thank you so much for attending. The support of people like you has meant so much as we have built out these webinar offerings. And we couldn't do any of this work without the Naomi and Nehemiah Cohen Foundation, which has funded our webinar series for many years. Thank you, Cohen Foundation. So before we get to the content and discussion, I briefly wanted to go over how to submit questions. I'll go over this in more detail later on, but if you're on now, just check this out. You can write at any point in the questions box, or after the presentation, you can raise your hand and ask verbally. Those are always exciting, and you can get out slightly more involved questions. So we can try that as well, and I'll walk through how to do that later on. So first, the ground rules before I hand it over to our amazing panelists. ELI, the organization running this webinar, is nonpartisan. We have an annual award gala at the end of each year. Many of our recipients are Republican, many are Democrat, a lot don't have political affiliations that I know of, so we don't take political stands or advocate. We try to do research and education from a balanced perspective. However, we let research and education speak for itself. For example, if we were around in the 1960s when the Cuyahoga River was lighting on fire on a routine basis, we would have showed photos, we would have researched the legal framework and talked about it, hosted webinars on it. And the underlying assumption that we would have made is that a river lighting on fire is not a positive thing. And hopefully, even in these very tense political times, that is still a nonpartisan issue, that river fires are bad. So likewise, today in the launch of the Environmental Accountability Project, we start from the underlying assumption that environmental conservation is important. However, how we get there is subject to debate, and we try to only lay out the facts. In this webinar series, we give experts who themselves may not come from the same background, who vary widely in where they come from. So, we try to balance each of the experts off each other. We give these experts a venue to engage in a productive way. However, if you don't agree with these experts, please feel free to ask questions. You can push certain topics, and you can definitely follow up with me afterwards. So for today's discussion, we have these amazing panelists on the line. I'll briefly introduce each of them later on, and you'll hear from them very shortly. While people are still trickling in, I will do a brief introduction. So for the intro to the topic, we first need to refresh where we are and where we might be going. Prior to the 2016 election cycle, when I thought of the wall, coming from, I've never practiced in this area, so when I thought of the wall, I thought of Pink Floyd. Now, I, along with most others, think about tweets and political rallies. The wall has entered the mindset of the general public after Donald Trump made the border wall a central campaign promise. Essentially, entering January 2017, discussions of the border wall were like the old quote from Field of Dreams, the baseball movie, but turned on its head. If you build it, they will not come. It was an immigration thing. Ostensibly, it's to prevent illegal immigration over the U.S.-Mexico border, and the wall took on a life of its own. We won't be talking in detail today about the human rights issues associated with illegal immigration solely. However, our panelists may touch on those as they're talking about their specific areas. That's a little outside of the scope of what we're doing today and would probably involve a lot longer webinar. What we're focusing on instead is the little talked about environmental and tribal rights impacts. So human rights definitely comes in both of those, and how they could play a role in the wall going from a campaign slogan to what they're trying to turn it into now, an infrastructure project. So that quote up there from the TNC director in Texas lays out much of the environmental stakes. But fragmentation is not limited to wildlife. It extends to communities, ecosystems, and even cultures. We'll delve into those issues today. So where are we now? It's complicated, and I'm not going to get into too much today, but on January 25th, Donald Trump signed an executive order for construction of the wall. The EO lays out intentions, but ground isn't quite ready to be broken yet. Lots of hoops have to be jumped through, things like how it's going to be funded, and different people have lots of different thoughts on that, including the president's Twitter feed. So now let's briefly touch on some frequently asked questions that we'll hit up today. So up there, I just laid up a few. Is it possible to construct a wall along the border? And the answer is almost certainly yes. We already have fence up, as our panelists will be talking today, and so that this isn't some abstract thing that definitely won't happen. How long could this process take? It's uncertain, and our panelists will talk about this today, but these things can move fast sometimes. Like if Congress acts, things can move fast. So we need to be prepared to discuss environmental impacts. And then finally, the three big questions: human costs, environmental costs, and environmental law. Those are really open to debate, and we'll be touching about those today. So that is our big question that our panelists will be addressing. So with that, we're going to start the presentations, the real meat of the webinar. You can see our presenters up there, and I'll introduce them each briefly when they come up. Our first presenter is Dan Millis from the Sierra Club. Dan is one of the foremost experts in this area for many, many years. Basically, you Google this, Dan's name comes up, everyone speaks glowingly of him, and he's going to be talking about some of the environmental impacts, his perspective on things, his experience, and whatever else he deems significant for this presentation. So we're really fortunate to have him, and now I am going to switch over the presenter to Dan so he can take away his presentation.
All right, well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's very nice introduction, very generous of you to say all those nice things about me. But my name is Dan Millis, and I've shared my screen with you, so hopefully you're all seeing this screen that says From Border Walls to Borderlands.
Looks great, and you sound great too.
Excellent, great. Well, I've been working with the Sierra Club on border issues since 2008. I'm originally from Flagstaff, Arizona, and so for me this is an issue that really impacts my state and the place where I grew up and the place where I still live today. I'm now based in Tucson and working for Sierra Club Grand Canyon chapter. That's the Arizona Sierra Club. And the Arizona Sierra Club started the Borderlands program kind of on a bottom-up type of format. It was really the grassroots volunteers who saw what was happening during wall construction during the Bush administration, saw the waiver of law that I'll talk about in a moment, and motivated to put together a film, which you might have seen. It came out in 2008, called Wild versus Wall. It's posted on our website, which I have up on the screen here. And they also fundraised enough to make an experimental staff position, and it was supposed to last about 6 months. I was the lucky border activist. I was working as a volunteer with No More Deaths at the time, and I was the lucky activist who got hired to do this job for 6 months and maybe more, and that was in October of 2008. And we have been moving forward ever since, and hopefully this presentation will give you a good idea of what we do. So I'd like to start by asking everyone what it is you think of when you think U.S.-Mexico border. So if I say the words U.S.-Mexico border and you had your eyes closed, what are the first images that pop into your mind? And when I've asked this question to audiences, without fail, one of the many images that people volunteer is the image of the wall. And we can see these images in our Google searches. This is a Google search that I did just a few minutes ago of the term U.S.-Mexico border. And obviously this is not a scientific survey here, but it gives us some idea of what it is that people are thinking of when they think about the U.S.-Mexico border, at least in terms of posting images online. And if we look at these top results, we see top to bottom, left to right, we see a wall, we see a map, we see a sort of a double wall with a vehicle in between. We see a zoomed out panorama of a wall. We see another wall, we see the map, we see the wall, we see a hole in the wall, we see a nice game of volleyball being played over the border barrier. Another wall, a wall, a wall, a wall, a wall and a vehicle barrier, a zoomed out picture of a wall, a zoomed in picture of a wall, a vehicle barrier, a map, a wall with a vehicle, and then a vehicle barrier, an agent, and an American flag. So it's a little bit repetitive in terms of the images here. And let's talk a little bit about the walls. This is a photograph that I took in a National Wildlife Refuge in South Texas. And since this is an environmental law webinar, I assume that most of the folks understand that national wildlife refuges are protected by federal law. And it's not a place where you can easily build a structure like this. It's not a place where you can even drive off-road without permission or go wood cutting. It's set aside, protected by federal law, set aside for wildlife. And yet the Bush administration was able to show up, bulldoze these areas, and build, in some cases, concrete walls right through the middle of them. Well, how is this possible? What a lot of folks don't realize, well, number one, folks don't realize that there are already lots of walls, hundreds of miles of barriers already built along the U.S.-Mexico border. And people also don't realize that these walls were built under the largest waiver of law in United States history. Now, at this point, I should mention I am simply an activist. I'm an organizer. I'm not a legal scholar or a legal expert by any means. But the legal experts that we work with tell me that this is the largest waiver of law in United States history, and I'll explain it here. The Real ID Act of 2005 had a section 102, which didn't get a whole lot of press attention. Real ID Act obviously was intended to standardize identification cards across the United States. But what folks didn't realize is that when the next year the Secure Fence Act passed, Secure Fence Act of 2006, that authorized the construction of 700 miles of barriers across the U.S.-Mexico border, signed by President George W. Bush. There he is signing the Secure Fence Act. But folks didn't realize that the Real ID Act, Section 102, gave the authority to the Department of Homeland Security to waive any law in order to build border infrastructure. And the Bush administration, as we know, was very gung-ho about these types of authorities, and the Bush administration began to waive many, many laws along the border in order to build walls, roads, and associated infrastructure. And as you can see popping on your screen here, these laws protected everything from endangered species, clean air and water, birds, archaeological sites, public health, rivers, farmland, coasts, wilderness, Native American graves, even religious freedom. And what I've posted here are 17 of the approximately 37 laws that were waived in part or in their entirety by the Bush administration in order to build border walls very quickly. This waiver authority was never rescinded. These waivers they don't have a sunset, so these laws are still off the books here in our borderlands. And it's very, very unfortunate, even tragic, I would say, that communities and resources in our borderlands don't get to count on the same protections that the rest of the country can take for granted. So that was a situation in 2006, 2007, 2008, when most of these barriers were constructed. And as a result, today we have 653 miles of border with some sort of barrier already standing. On 354 of those miles, we have what I call a wall, which is approximately the size of the taller structure that you see in this photo on the left. And then approximately 299 miles of vehicle barrier, which tend to be about the size of the structure that you see in this photograph on the right side of this photo. And as you'll see, there's a wide variety of different designs or architectures for these walls and barriers. The location of these barriers is pretty well drawn out here in this 2011 graphic from the Washington Post. And you'll note that California, Arizona, and New Mexico have seen most of the barriers in terms of where they've been installed already. And there have been quite a bit of barrier construction in Texas as well, although not as much because of the Rio Grande. These walls block wildlife. We've already seen a few of these photographs, but these are the deer that are blocked by the walls that go through the San Pedro Riparian National Conservation Area in Arizona. And I've seen this myself in that same spot. This is a toad being blocked by some walls that are built through Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. And you'll note that some of the types of structures that have been built are fairly solid, and so even small species like reptiles and toads and whatnot can't cross. Here's a photograph of a bird that somehow got stuck in between the layers of mesh of a piece of border wall and died there. This wall is not designed with wildlife in mind, and I'll talk more about that. And there's that photograph again from Krista, an amazing photographer and photojournalist. She's written a lot on this, Krista Schleier. You should look her up. But these little creatures are javelina. And again, they're at that section of wall that goes through the San Pedro Conservation Area in Arizona. This, you may know, this species, you may have seen the cartoon. This is a roadrunner. It's a photograph that I took of a bird running back and forth along the wall. Here is a diamondback rattlesnake. Here we have a mountain lion. This photograph is taken at night, obviously. This is a horned lizard or a horny toad. And that's a cottontail rabbit that you can see very well camouflaged there. So in addition to these photographs that are, more or less anecdotal evidence, there has also been a lot of science done that documents the impacts and potential impacts to various species. Some of the species that have been identified are species like the puma and the coati that have been impacted or that have where measurable impacts have been documented. But we also have a lot of endangered species in the borderlands, and some of these studies have identified threatened species that are being impacted now and that would be impacted even more, and the greater number of species would be impacted more if the walls were to be expanded under a scenario such as the one that Trump has proposed. This is the jaguar. This is the most recent jaguar photograph to come out of the United States. This is the one that was taken in the Huachuca Mountains near Sierra Vista, Arizona. And you may have heard about El Jefe, the jaguar where video was taken of the cat just south of Tucson in the Santa Rita Mountains. That's a different cat than this one. This one's even newer than El Jefe. So we've got one or two jaguar that we know of in the United States. Both of them came across the border from larger breeding populations in northern Mexico. And since both of these cats are male, we know that if we were to seal off the border, we would no longer have any jaguar in the United States. This little one is an ocelot. It's a similar species to the jaguar, and just like the jaguar, it was thought to have been extinct from Arizona. It was hunted into extirpation, but these camera traps and recent developments have resulted in photographs like this one. This is an ocelot photograph taken in Arizona, and there have been several sightings and photographs of ocelot in Arizona. There's also breeding populations of ocelot in southern Texas, South Texas, where many of the border walls have been built through those national wildlife refuges there. And I'll just put in this picture of the Sonoran pronghorn, which is the fastest land mammal in the Western Hemisphere. They live southwest of me in the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument, that area, and they're an amazing species. They're very reclusive. they're sort of a success story right now because their numbers in the United States were down to under 30, if I'm not mistaken, and now we're up to several hundred animals. So if you have a wall that blocks this wildlife, then the wildlife can't migrate. Wildlife's habitat gets smaller. If they can't find mates, they can become inbred, and their genetic diversity can be so poor that it threatens their survival. Down near the Rio Grande, some of those solid concrete walls either trap wildlife during flood events or isolate wildlife from their primary water source, which is the river itself. These are just a few of the many endangered species that live along the U.S.-Mexico border. In addition to the wildlife considerations, border walls cause flooding. And this is a photograph of some flooding damage from a desert area, a very dry area called Organ Pipe Cactus National Monument. This is one of the walls built by the Bush administration through a wild, natural area. And because they waived so many laws that require that things be done properly and that studies be done beforehand, they didn't bother to figure out how or where even these flash flood zones were located. And so what might look like a nice flat sandy spot during the dry season can turn into a flood zone during our wet season. And what you see here is a bunch of debris piled up against the wall, the steel and concrete wall that was built through the National Monument. The debris blocked up the water, caused the wall to act as a dam. And because it's not designed for that kind of pressure, the dam fell over, the dam breached, the wall fell over, and you can see some of that damage that occurred to the wall there. Now, of course, not only the wall was damaged, but the surrounding area was damaged, and this erosion was a problem that the park rangers had to fix. They had to come back and fill it in and revegetate. And that's a big deal for the park rangers, but it's an even bigger problem when these types of floods happen in our border communities. And what you're seeing here is a picture of border community of Nogales. Nogales is one community divided by a wall. So you have Nogales, Arizona on the left, Nogales, Sonora on the right. And if you look sort of where it says hotel, look in that neighborhood. This is sort of the before photograph, and this is the during photograph of the 2008 flood, where again the wall acts as a dam. And so I'll show you that before photograph, and you can see that during the flood you have about 6 feet of water inundating downtown Nogales, Sonora. On the left side of the border wall, you can see near the black car there is a person walking in about ankle-deep water. The flooding is not nearly as bad on the downstream side of the wall. But in Nogales, Sonora, cars floated everywhere. There was debris strewn about the entire community, millions of dollars in damages. 2 people that we know of drowned during this flood. Even the streets collapsed from the overloaded drainage system in Nogales, Sonora. So a huge problem. Nogales is a place that is flood prone anyway, so when these walls are installed and flooding is not taken into account, that problem gets much worse. We've also had the same problems when walls have fallen down and the floodwaters have rushed into Arizona all at once. So these are photographs from a 2014, if I'm not mistaken. This is in 2014 when the wall fell down, and this time we're looking at Arizona neighborhoods, Arizona homes that were inundated by this wall of water that came rushing in when the wall near Nogales fell down during a flood event. So you can imagine how you would feel if this was your home and if these problems were happening in your community. Our border communities tend to be very safe, but they also tend to be very poor, so this is an environmental justice issue that we're looking at. And it would be one thing if these walls were really solving problems on the border, but the fact is they're not. They're not addressing the root cause. They're not working. They're one of the most expensive and least effective ways to approach border security, as this photograph of ladders piled up against the wall really illustrates. So, you know, I was told that it would be okay to try to have a little bit of fun on this and not take it too seriously, so I hope it's all right, David. We've got a kind of goofy graphic here, but I wanted to tell you a little bit about Trump's plan and what little we know about his wall. We know that in December of 2016, he asked the Department of Homeland Security to assess all assets available for border wall and barrier construction. The Department of Homeland Security said that barriers could be built along the U.S. borders with Mexico, 413 miles, and it would cost $11.37 billion. They also, in their report, included that 452 miles of the Canadian border could be walled at a cost of $3.3 billion. The Government Accountability Office came out with a report. There's been several reports like this, but this one said that it's about $6.5 million per mile to build a single layer wall, which tends to look like this. This small photograph shows the Otay Mountain Wilderness area in California, where the roadless wilderness area was bulldozed and walls were built on very steep slopes up and down through an area that did not have a lot of cross-border traffic. So that's what a single layer border wall looks like. And then those $10.4 million per mile double layer border walls look more like this section in San Diego, where you have one layer of wall and then an open area and then another layer of wall. In some cases, there's even a third layer of chain link fencing, making a triple layered barrier. In January of this year, Trump issued his famous executive order to build border walls as soon as possible using the Secure Fence Act of 2006. And just this month, an internal Department of Homeland Security report was leaked that showed $21.6 billion price tag for Trump's wall, which laid out 3 phases. The first phase being a 26-mile total section, or sections, I should say, several sections of wall in the San Diego, El Paso, and Rio Grande sectors. Those are the titles that Border Patrol has for different areas, are sectors. The second phase would be 151 miles in total in the Tucson, El Paso, Big Bend, Laredo, and Rio Grande sectors. And then this amazing report, phase 3, says we'll also build 1,080 additional miles somewhere. So not a lot to go on there. The report also talked about, well, it basically assumed that this would be funded in April of this year and the construction could begin in September. Obviously, we're going to do everything in our power to prevent that funding from going through. And everyone knows that Trump has said that Mexico will pay, and the Republican Congress, however, has recently said that U.S. taxpayers will pay for this. And I can send you more information on that if you're interested. So I'm running over on time, but I'll just let you know that we're the Sierra Club. We say the thing that we have to do when it comes to border issues is to address the root causes. The walls do not address the root causes. They don't address any of the problems, really, because they don't work. But we think that supporting comprehensive immigration reform with a just path to citizenship would be a great way to start looking at the root causes and really do something about the problem. We also think that sustainable development programs, such as Café Justo, this is just coffee, if you haven't heard of it, it's a really neat program. But these are programs that allow people to make a decent living in their countries of origin. And these programs really work, and they cost very little compared to border walls. We do a lot of grassroots and media outreach. We talk to reporters, educate the public, go on field trips, do stuff like this. And of course, we try to take action, organize, lobby, etc. So that's what we're up to at the Sierra Club. And our goal is that when we get back to this image, again, and then when people think about the border, when we think U.S.-Mexico border, instead of thinking just about walls, people should really think more about water and wildlife and what the borderlands are really all about. And so this is a Google image search from the future. You'll notice in the bottom right corner that I traveled to the future in order to get this Google image search. But when I searched U.S.-Mexico border in 2020, what I got were photographs of wildlife, the bison. There is a wild herd of bison that lives in the New Mexico boot heel and roams across the border into Chihuahua. Of course, we still have the game of volleyball because that's a great photograph, but there are pictures of the borderlands, pictures of the wildlife, the rivers. Remember that most of the border is a river, that 1,200 miles along the Rio Grande, whereas we have less than 400 miles of walls. So really we're thinking about the border and the borderlands backwards when we think of walls and not rivers. So that's what you're seeing in this photograph. You're seeing a bit of community art on old historic pieces of border wall. That's in the bottom right. You're seeing a bit of restoration that's been done where there's a picture of the desert with a sign. That used to be an unauthorized vehicle track, and that's been restored. And this would be a much more accurate and complete picture of the borderlands, and that's what we're really going for. So I apologize for going over on time, but thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thanks so much, Dan. That was a great summary of all the issues and, Sierra Club's view of them and your view of them. And it also makes me want to have a pet ocelot. So hopefully that those populations get restored so, the world can have them. So our next presenter is Sarah Krakoff from the University of Colorado Law School. She's going to be talking about indigenous rights issues. So Sarah, I'm going to hand this off to you. Let me know if you're not the one that gets the invite.
Okay. That went to the other Sarah.
Okay, sorry about that. Should be in the right hands now. And for everyone on the line, if you want to submit questions, you can write them in anytime on the questions panel on the right-hand side of your screen. And at the end, there'll also be a chance to ask them out loud. So thanks for bearing with me as I screwed up that handoff.
Okay, are you all seeing my screen now?
Yeah, see it and hear you loud and clear.
Okay, well thanks. Thank you, David. And thank you for that great introduction that covered so many of the issues. So I thought I would start out by talking about just generally what Native American nations or American Indian tribes have to do with the topic about a border wall. And maybe first a word about vocabulary. Whenever I teach American Indian law, one of my students or more will ask, is it okay to say American Indian? And the answer is yes. The words American Indian, first of all, are all over the law. And to many Native people, certainly everyone I've ever worked with or met, they use the two interchangeably. And first and foremost, they would use the name of their own Native nation or tribe. I'm Navajo, I'm Zuni, I'm Hopi. So, okay, with that bit about terminology out of the way, so what do American Indian tribes have to do with the topic of a border wall? So first, some general background about the legal status of tribes in the United States. There are 567 federally recognized Native nations or American Indian tribes. They have a direct relationship with the federal government, and they have the capacities of sovereigns with the ability to regulate and govern within their territorial boundaries, with many important and very complicated exceptions under U.S. law. So Native nations are governments, is sort of the upshot, and this makes them very different from other disenfranchised or minority groups within the United States. They have their own laws, often they have their own legal systems. They have a variety of unique rights that stem from this direct government-to-government relationship with the federal government. And so that's the background. And so anytime we think about the rights of Native people and Native nations, we have to think about this unique body of law, American Indian law. So currently, of those 567 tribes in the U.S., many of which are up in Alaska, but a large number of which are in the lower 48. Of that number, currently 25 tribes have land within approximately 200 miles of international borders between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. And so this is a map of the southern border, and you can see the tribes that have land within that 200 miles of the border with Mexico. On the Mexico side, which is where we are, Trump did not promise to build a wall between us and Canada. So we're only looking at this southern border. And the only two Native nations that actually straddle the border are the Tohono O'odham, there on the southern border of Arizona, and then the Kickapoo over in Texas. So they're not only within 200 miles, but they actually share a border with Mexico. And for these native nations, the border is, a wholly new and artificial construct. And you can see on this map that Tohono O'odham, in fact, their Aboriginal lands extend into Sonora, and their Aboriginal land base was divided when the United States acquired, a huge chunk of what is now the southwestern United States after the Mexican-American War in 1848, and then in the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, purchased chunks of Texas, right, separated those tribes on the southern border, and just drew a line right through their Aboriginal territory, and that's true for Tohono O'odham and the Kickapoo. So the region's remote location and sparse population at the time of the middle of the 19th century resulted in the fact that there was no formal agreement between the United States and Mexico about the tribal border crossing rights for the Kickapoo or the Tohono O'odham or any of the other tribes. And I'll just mention this is different from the situation in Canada. There is, in fact, a treaty. It's gone through many revisions, but it's called the Jay Treaty that recognized that the Ojibwe on the northern border had a right to move back and forth, notwithstanding this line that didn't mean anything to them that cut through their Aboriginal territory. So no formal agreement was reached with respect to the tribes on the southern border. But for a long time, this didn't really matter because there were no fences, as we know from Dan in his previous talk. No big fences and boundaries and so forth until after the Secure Fences Act and the Real ID Act after 9/11. So after 9/11, travel became more difficult, and various Homeland Security measures did not include tribes in their provisions. For example, the Homeland Security Act didn't provide any direct funding to tribes, and yet at the same time, it became increasingly difficult, and then to the point of physically difficult after the construction of the fences for tribal members to cross the border. And this had all kinds of effects on the tribes. I will mention before moving on that the Kickapoo tribe, to the next slide, did, unlike Tohono O'odham, have legislation passed in 1983 which allowed Kickapoo tribal members to freely pass across the U.S.-Mexico border. But that situation was changed, again, after 9/11 with requirements for secure IDs and as well passports. Mexico requires U.S. passports for travel. So even for the Kickapoo, that recognition of their rights to freely cross the border was changed after 9/11. So already, even before Trump's election and his talk of a wall, the border and the Border Patrol have created problems for the Kickapoo and the Tohono O'odham. And now I'm going to shift and just talk mainly about the Tohono O'odham because they're bigger and have come out with stronger statement in the wake of Trump's announcement about a wall. So first I'll just talk about some of the effects already because of the construction of the fence that Dan discussed. And again, the effects sort of run both directions. They have insufficient support, right? The Homeland Security approach to date has provided insufficient support to Tohono O'odham for them to successfully address the effects of smuggling of humans and drugs across the border. And at the same time, it inhibits travel of the Tohono O'odham people. So in terms of the effects on the tribe of illegal border crossings and drug smuggling and so forth, there are just huge environmental and social impacts on Tohono O'odham. In Tohono O'odham, the reservation is about the size of Connecticut. It's the second biggest land base, I believe. Navajo Nation is the biggest. Their reservation is the size of West Virginia. So Tohono O'odham has a big land base, and they, it's extremely rural, and it's difficult, to keep track of everything that happens on the border. And so as a result, there is a lot of migration, and it includes drug smuggling, huge amounts of trash, including vehicles, rusted vehicles, garbage, and then of course most tragically, it includes dead bodies on the Tohono O'odham side of the border, people trying to cross and dying because of the heat or lack of water, or just ill treatment. So each year the tribe spends in excess of about $3 million on law enforcement addressing these border issues out of its own funds. And that's at the expense of what they could be doing to increase public health and safety on the rest of their nation. At the same time, and this is true for the Kickapoo too and other tribes, but again, just focusing on the Tohono O'odham, they cannot cross the southern border to access sacred sites, to access relatives and community members. And you can just click back for a second to the other slide to remind you here. Right, this is, their Aboriginal territory includes land that's larger than or close to the land on the U.S. side of the border, and that now their land base is cut in half in a much more physical and in some places literally concrete way. So there are effects, negative effects running both ways for the Tohono O'odham. And as a result, they're not happy with the situation to date with the sort of fence wall kind of thing. And so they certainly weren't welcoming of the idea of an even larger border wall. And so this is the statement made by the tribe's vice chair. Over my dead body will a wall be built. We hope, of course, that's not literally true. But the tribe has come out officially opposing construction of the wall on their border, and that would result in this 75-mile gap in the border wall. So since we're all, most of us, I think, lawyers here, that's the factual backdrop, and also, of course, the legal context for understanding why the Tohono O'odham Nation and the Kickapoo and maybe other tribes, even those who don't have a border, might have different legal rights with respect to this situation, and certainly the legal effects on them are different. But what are the possibilities for making, for the Tohono O'odham, this 75-mile gap in the wall real? There's this question about whether or not existing legislation, the Secure Fence Act, already authorizes the construction of a wall across Tohono O'odham land. And this is tribal trust land. It's land held by the tribe, for the tribe by the federal government in trust for the tribe. And I know that certainly the tribe would argue that existing legislation doesn't authorize the construction of the fence. It's unclear, I think, probably, whether that's the case or not. It certainly is an untested question. So I would assume if Tohono O'odham is serious about opposition, they would litigate if there was an attempt to build a wall without any further legislative authorization. But, of course, Congress could pass legislation, and in federal Indian law, Congress has very broad powers in Indian affairs, including the ability to pass legislation that breaches treaty terms. And again, that wouldn't go untested. I think if Congress passed legislation, there could be a challenge to that in court, but under current Indian law doctrine, it could be an uphill battle. The federal government has a trust obligation to tribes, meaning that because of the unique federal-tribal relationship, the federal government has an obligation, one that it took on early on in the history of our republic, to safeguard the interests of tribes and tribal governments. Of course, in many situations that ends up devolving into what is essentially a moral obligation. It has legal aspects to it, but tribes are very much subject to the political leanings of a particular administration. And I don't think we've seen anything in this administration so far that indicates to us that it would take the tribe's interests and sort of prioritize them over the interest in constructing this wall. Then moving sort of down to sort of, I guess you could say, softer forms of law, tribes do have the right to be consulted about actions taken that affect their land and their powers of self-governance and so forth. That's embodied in an executive order 13175. And again, though, the extent to which that's a full-throated right to be consulted versus a sort of a check-the-box kind of approach to consultation, oh, we talked to the tribe and now we're moving on with the border wall, is very dependent on who is in the agencies of the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security in this case, and the other agencies that would, I guess, carry out the construction of this wall. And then, of course, there is political advocacy. Tribes do have a very strong lobbying voice in D.C. and Congress, much stronger than they did several decades ago. And I think we might predict that if Tohono O'odham sticks to its position of opposing this wall, they might build on the momentum that surrounded the support for Standing Rock in its opposition to the pipeline, and try to build a sort of political movement to oppose the wall's construction on the Tohono O'odham section. There are then, moving to the international legal options, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that's the unfortunate acronym there, UNDRIP, has provisions that give Indigenous peoples rights to self-determination of varying kinds. Several of the provisions of UNDRIP would certainly be implicated by the construction of a wall, including the rights of tribes to have free, prior, informed consent to actions taken on their lands, and then several other provisions. Whether or not the tribe resorting to international fora, either a UN forum or the Inter-American Commission, which is sort of our regional version of the UN forum, you could say, to object to U.S. action here would have any effect on the U.S. government is unclear. Our government, even in previous administrations, is not all that mindful of decisions that issue to it from these international fora when it concerns indigenous rights, but it can all be part of a larger political strategy for the tribe. Then, of course, there are options that the tribe has, as do all U.S. citizens and litigants under environmental laws, but I'm just going to refer you back to Dan's presentation here. The problem is that the environmental laws are in a state of suspension because of the Real ID Act. And again, to compare to Standing Rock brought litigation against the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline based on unique rights that tribes have, including the consultation rights, but also powerful rights under federal environmental statutes. So without those being operative, then tribes too lose powerful legal weapons and arguments in this kind of a battle. So I will leave it at that, and happy to see if there are questions later after the other panelists.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's so wonderful to have a tribal legal expert on here, solely because these issues are so often overlooked, and I know that this isn't something I knew a lot about, and you taught me a lot, and I have a lot of questions too. So for me and others, we're going to do all the questions at the end of the panelists, so we have 2 more to go, and so you can write them into the questions box at any point during the presentation. We have some great ones already. So our next presenter is Andy Gordon. Andy has done just about everything in his career, so I'm not going to summarize what he's done too much because he'll get into some of that. But Andy, basically, he's worked on past defense issues. He's seen how this works in practice. He has a really practical understanding of how the law interacts with politics, and we always like to have someone that kind of gets how it works on the ground on these. So Andy, if you're ready to take it away, you can go.
I am, Dave. Thanks very much. Dave was pretty polite and discreet there to be more direct, and I know some of the people who are attending today know me from my prior position at the Department of Homeland Security. I was counsel to the Secretary on fence issues in 2009 and 2010, and so I had direct on-the-ground experience from the DHS side on the fence. There are several practical things I want to talk about in the few minutes here, and I know, and justifiably so, that there is a lot of concern about the building of a wall along the border and how rapidly it can happen, particularly in light of the environmental waivers. And there is a lot justifiably to be concerned about, although, as I have said to several reporters and other sources, the president cannot tweet the wall into existence. There are real, huge, practical issues that the administration faces if they want to go forward. The first slide that's up here is, and it's similar to a slide that was shown earlier, shows where the fence is right now. And what you're going to see is that while it is largely completed in California, Arizona, and most of New Mexico, it is largely not completed in Texas. Texas is overwhelmingly the largest uncompleted area, and there are a couple of reasons for that. One is obviously the Rio Grande constitutes the bulk of that area, and you cannot build a fence or a wall in the middle of the Rio Grande for a number of reasons, including the International Boundary Water Commission issues. But the biggest obstacle, which means it has to go on solid land, obviously on the U.S. side, and the biggest obstacle is that unlike the property in Arizona and largely California and New Mexico, that's privately held land. And before the government can build any wall on the privately held land, it has to acquire the land. When I got to Homeland Security in 2009, at that point there were over 700 condemnation lawsuits pending in Texas alone, with private property owners objecting to the government taking their land. This conflict between private property rights and the perceived need for this construction is a huge political fight in Texas, and to be, I'm not taking a partisan side, but I've got to use partisan terms here, a huge political fight within the Republican Party because of their view of private property rights. So when the president says, or the new Secretary of Homeland Security says, we'll have this done in 2 years, that's simply not going to happen. Putting aside the planning issues, first the property has to be acquired, and that's going to be wrapped up in litigation, at least in Texas, for a long time. And that's one of the reasons why the Texas Republican delegation, particularly those members with districts along the southern part of the Texas border, have either come out in opposition to Trump's plan or have been remarkably silent. That private property takings issue is an enormous issue. Secondly, there is simply a planning issue. The physical construction takes planning, it takes bidding, and all of that takes time, which again is not done anywhere close to being done yet. The fence that's currently up, which is approximately 700 miles, it's a little short of 700 miles, putting Texas aside, the easy places to build have been built on, and the high traffic areas where, without getting in deeply into the immigration aspects, the places where, from an immigration illegal flow of immigrants concern, was the highest, those places have been built on. What's not built on outside of Texas is largely very difficult, very up and down terrain. Can we go to the next slide, Dave? This, yeah, that one, the border fence appropriate. You know, I just realized I didn't attribute these slides come from a wonderful article put out by the Cato Institute. As a sometime law professor, I now see I forgot to do that, and that was my bad. This shows how fence was built over time. Actually, what you can see is actually the first parts of walls and fence were built back in '96. The huge surge in the building was during the Bush administration, after the passage of the Secure Fence Act, and then in the 2009, 2010, 11 timeframe, some additional fencing was built during the Obama administration, which was what I was involved with, and where I did in fact meet some of you. The cost is generally estimated, if they're really going to build 700 more miles of fence, somewhere between $20 and $25 billion. The reason that cost is so high is not only are the construction costs very high, but there's the land acquisition costs I mentioned before. Let me go back on the land acquisition for one moment. And Sarah alluded to the fact that there's approximately 75 miles across the O'odham Nation, which has not been built on, and that would take, not completely clear, but I think would take an act of Congress to do that, which is another obstacle. Anyway, it's probably going to take $20 to $25 billion if they were actually going to do this construction. Currently, the thinking is that they may have available to them in uncommitted available funds, maybe somewhere from $300 to $500 million at the maximum, which isn't, you know, they used to say it sounds like a lot of money, but isn't going to get them very far in this project. So they're going to need a very substantial appropriation over time. And if the Trump administration is going to stick to the notion that they're not going to grow the deficit or grow the budget, every dollar they spend to build wall is not being spent on something else. Can we go to the next slide, Dave? Yeah. Dan talked about the various kinds of structure that's currently up, and as you can see here, currently there's a lot of different kinds of fencing that's being used depending upon the particular terrain and the assessed needs at the time. None of this is anything close to the 30-foot wall that the president has talked about. Now, whether that is just Trumpian hyperbole or not, we don't know, but there's nothing comparable to it at this point, which just magnifies the engineering difficulties of building it. Dan laid out wonderfully the, there are enough environmental problems with the existing fence structures. A wall is a wall. Can we go to the next slide then? And I want to spend a couple of moments just talking about what the executive order itself says. It talks about secure the southern border of the United States through the construction of a physical wall on the southern border, monitored to prevent immigration, drug and human trafficking, and acts of terrorism. In addition to what the other things I do, I also teach national security law at Arizona State University, Sandra Day O'Connor School of Law. They want us to use the whole name when we talk about the law school. There's no reason to believe that this wall would have any significant impact on drug trafficking or acts of terrorism. The drug trafficking, while there may be some coming through, it's not a significant amount. Most of that comes through by air, sea, or frankly through the existing ports in places like Nogales, where they bring it through in trucks. 80% plus of the illegal drug traffic that comes in from Mexico is marijuana, which is large and bulky and needs to go in large containers. And we have, at least at the time I was at Homeland Security, and from what I can gather subsequent to them, we have no record of any terrorists coming through the southern border this way. Can we go down a little bit, Dave, to the next page? Yeah. So what I want to point out here are two things. While he calls it a wall, the executive order really says physical wall or other similarly secure, impassable physical barrier. I don't, maybe that's a wall, maybe that's a fence. Impassable by whom, I don't know. Operational control means, this is the really frightening one. Operational control shall mean the prevention of all unlawful entries into the United States. That's just a remarkably hyperbolic statement to assume that a country the size of the United States, with the amount of border we have, and you got to realize, of course, that the Mexican border is just a small percentage of the total border the United States have, that we could ever prevent or would be willing to spend the money or it's worth the effort to stop all unlawful entries into the United States. Can we go down one more, please? What's interesting in the remaining portions of this order is it doesn't actually say where the fence is going, or excuse me, where the wall is going to be built, or what it's going to look like. It just says using appropriate materials and technologies to effectively achieve, but then it says complete operational control. So at this point in time, we really have no idea, and the president has been so dismissive of what's up there already. I candidly can't tell whether he's talking about taking down fence that currently exists and replacing it with wall, putting wall up where there is no fence now, doing both. In terms of specifics, as someone else has already pointed out, the best is yet to come. And let's go down to the final part of this. From an environmental perspective, while the order itself doesn't talk about the waiver power, which is absolute, it does talk about permitting all officers, employees of the United States, as well as local, to have access to all federal lands as necessary to and appropriate to implement this order. When I was at Homeland Security and we were working on the construction we were working on that time, we were not utilizing the waivers, and we were very heavily involved in what's referred to as the interagency process. Whether they plan to do that going forward or not, I don't know. My bottom line is that there are a lot of real-life complications to doing this. It's a frightening prospect, or at least from my perspective, it's a frightening process. But there's also a huge number of bumps in the road ahead, and whether Congress, and particularly the Senate, and particularly the senators in Arizona and Texas really want this to happen, we'll see if they have the stomach for that fight. Dave, I'll save the rest of the time for questions later on.
Thanks so much, Andy. Getting some of the practical experience you've had is just invaluable, and really appreciate you being frank about all those issues. So now we're going to hand it off to our final panelist, which is Sarah Burke from Earthjustice. Sarah works on pretty much everything. She'll describe a little bit, I'm sure, about what Earthjustice does. But yeah, she has tons of expertise on this, is thinking about ways that Earthjustice might approach this border wall, and I'll let her talk more about that. So Sarah, I'm going to try to hand it over to you. Since we have two Sarahs, it might go to the wrong one, but let me know if you get that.
Okay, I got it. Do you see my screen?
Yes, it looks perfect.
Great. Well, thank you, David, for that.
Sorry, Sarah, one more thing. Your speaker notes are up on the screen. So
they are on the screen. Whoops. Let me see how I can do this.
Perfect. They're not on the screen now, so.
Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you, David, for that introduction. I was asked to talk a little bit about some of the legal issues surrounding the border wall, the legal authorities, and perhaps grounds for challenging the wall. And I have to say that following Dan and Sarah and Andy, my job has been made very easy, as they've done a really thorough job of laying out a lot of the legal authorities and issues. So I'm going to move through this somewhat quickly with an eye on the time, and hope we can get to questions. And I'm happy to talk in more detail about anything I touch on if there's interest in that during the question time. So as the previous panelists have made clear, this is not the first time that the prospect of a wall along the southern border has come up. We saw a significant increase in impassable infrastructure during the Bush administration, and at least from the perspective of the federal government, the legal authorities for Trump's wall are generally holdovers from that era or just preceding it. As has already been explained, prior to 1996, federal immigration statutes didn't expressly authorize or require the construction of barriers along the international borders. Authority to build such barriers would have probably primarily derived from the general statutory authority of the Attorney General, now the Secretary of Homeland Security, to guard the boundaries and borders of the United States against the illegal entry of aliens. But with the passage in 1996 of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, Homeland Security's specific authority to deploy barriers along international borders was passed. I want to focus specifically on Section 102, which has been alluded to previously, so I'll run through it quickly. But it does authorize Homeland Security to construct barriers to deter illegal crossings, particularly at locations of high illegal entry. It requires construction of fencing covering at least 700 miles along the border. Subsequent amendments have made clear that those 700 miles are not required to be in any particular location. And as I think Andy said, we are almost at 700, but are a little shy of the 700 miles that are required by Section 102. And then perhaps most significantly, Section 102C provides the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security with authority to waive any legal requirements which may impede construction of barriers and roads. And I want to just pause on the waiver issue, as it's one of the most troubling aspects of the border wall. So, as originally enacted, Section 102C only gave the Secretary authority to waive the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act, which is bad enough. But in 2005, Congress passed the Real ID Act, which amended Section 102 to allow the Secretary to waive all legal requirements deemed necessary to ensure expeditious construction of barriers. And it explicitly limited the scope of possible challenges to the Secretary's use of the waiver authority to claims alleging violations under the United States Constitution. So I'm a little behind on my slides here. And as Dan and Sarah have, have shown in their presentations, the construction of border infrastructure has really significant impacts on people as well as on wildlife and ecosystems. And so, given the limitations on judicial review, what legal avenues are there or might there be to challenge additional construction of a border wall? And as a starting point, we can look back to the challenges that were brought in 2005 to 2008 against the Bush border fence. So because of the waiver, these cases had to be brought on constitutional theories, and unfortunately, they were uniformly unsuccessful. The first constitutional theory that was tried is the idea of non-delegation, and there were 3 cases brought in which plaintiffs asserted that allowing the president to waive applicable laws was an unconstitutional delegation of the legislative power to pass laws. Those cases were dismissed, though that theory was not taken up by the courts. A second constitutional theory that was tried was under the presentment clause, which is actually a couple of clauses in the Constitution that lays out how statutes are to be enacted and amended. Essentially that they're drafted by Congress and then presented to the president for either signature or veto, and that by allowing the president to waive these laws, it was a violation of the presentment clause. It was allowing the president to essentially amend or repeal laws. The courts also did not buy that legal theory, arguing that the laws remained in place, but the president's action, the executive's actions were waivers that were bounded by limits delineated in law and were not actually altering the underlying laws themselves. And the final constitutional challenge that was tried was a 10th Amendment challenge brought by the County of El Paso, which argued that the waiver of all state and local laws was a violation of the preemption doctrine, so that the authorities reserved to state and local governments under the 10th Amendment allow them to continue to enforce their state and local laws. But unfortunately, the district court in Texas in that case held that Congress had, in the text of the statute, explicitly preempted state and local laws, and that also in their effect, because of the conflict between federal and state and local laws, they were also preempted. So where does that leave us? Are there new legal theories that might be tried to challenge any additional construction of a border wall under Trump's executive order? Two areas that have kind of been touched on that I just kind of want to note are the special rights that the Native American communities living along the borders have, and the potential for perhaps a constitutional claim invoking the indigenous communities' First Amendment rights. As Sarah described, the Tohono O'odham travel their ancestral lands cross the U.S.-Mexico border, and they have ceremonies that require them to travel from Arizona down to Sonora, Mexico, and that construction of a wall would prevent them from the free exercise of their religion. So, perhaps there's a First Amendment claim that can be brought there. Related claims that Sarah also touched on are international claims based on the special rights of indigenous communities under international law and human rights law, including a right to prior informed consent, rights to practice culture and religion. And as Sarah said, one of those strategies would be part of broader political strategies that would bring pressure to bear on the government to change its policies on the wall, rather than being legal actions that could result in any kind of enforceable judgment. And the last legal theory that I wanted to highlight is one that was floated by Professor Daniel Hemel at the University of Chicago, who looked at last year, or maybe I think it's the year before now, last year's Supreme Court decision, Michigan versus EPA, in which the Supreme Court held that the language necessary and appropriate in the Clean Air Act required EPA to conduct a cost-benefit analysis before issuing regulations. And Professor Hemel noticed that the language in the Real ID Act also requires the Secretary of Homeland Security to issue waivers as necessary and appropriate. And so the theory would be that any consideration of waiver to construct the border would have to include a cost-benefit analysis. And as we know, the costs associated with a wall are extremely high, and the benefits in terms of accomplishing the purposes of such a wall are questionable. So this theory of a sort of a regulatory cost-benefit analysis might be the basis for a challenge. Any of these avenues are going to be uphill battles. There's also the question of how do you actually get that cost-benefit analysis into court if it has to be part of a constitutional claim. The APA has been waived, and so judicial review as it would normally occur isn't possible, and that's where that kind of analysis would usually be brought. So because of the breadth of the waiver, because of the discretion courts give to the executive when acting on foreign policy and national security issues, any legal challenge is going to be an uphill battle. But I'm hopeful that creative legal minds can come up with some viable theories, and we'll see as the policies around the wall go from a rather broad executive order with many hurdles to its implementation, as Andy described, to actual concrete action. We'll see if the possibility of legal challenge arises. So I'll leave it there with an eye on the time and turn it back to David.
Thanks so much, Sarah. I know that was a great presentation because I was literally found myself on the edge of my seat when you were describing legal theories and getting to the last one. So that's how, it's great. So thanks so much to all the panelists, and thanks for everyone that's on the line. We still have tons of people here. So if you have any questions, you can type them into the question box, or you can raise your hand manually using the GoTo system, and we can experiment with that. So we have some questions here, and I'll hop to those right now unless I see a hand up. So first, we had a couple that touched on takings. So the issue of takings of private land to build this wall, is this just is it a condemnation process? How does it work in practice in terms of getting it from filing for it to completing it? How long does it take? And do those lawsuits, are they just a matter of time before the court rules in favor of the government, or are they more contentious than that? So, Andy, I believe you were talking about that. So I'd love for you to start.
Generally speaking, the government, federal government, has the right of condemnation against property owners, and there's a process that it takes to run through. And as Sarah Burt alluded to, the rights of the government when it comes to border issues are especially deferred to. So there's little doubt that they have the right to take, but the lawsuits themselves can take quite a while, depending on what judge you draw, what the courts are. There's just a lot that goes into it. But when I was there were takings lawsuits that have been pending over 7 years.
Wow. Yeah, and that was my inclination to just knowing about how this works in other places with totally different issues.
They could try and get something through Congress to accelerate the takings process along the border, but under the Fifth Amendment, they can't take the property without due process, including compensation.
Great. So we have a couple great questions here. Sarah, in her follow-up presentation, answered a lot of the earlier ones. So this question is from one of our attendees. It's asking about President Clinton's Executive Order 12898 on environmental justice. So could that be used to hold DHS accountable, or was that one of the laws waived, or is that not applicable here because it's an executive order? I mean, do you guys have any feel on how environmental justice and the executive order could play a role? And I don't know, Sarah, if you've thought about that issue, Sarah Burt.
Yeah, it could. The problem with an executive order is that it's extremely easy to reverse. And so although it's not explicitly part of the statutory waiver, it would be easy for President Trump to say that it does not apply. I wonder whether the argument could be made that it could also be waived because the text of the statutory waiver is so broad. It says any laws. So I think an argument could be made that it is also waived. If it is not also waived, it could be easily made to be waived. But I like the idea of thinking about the environmental justice angle.
Great. Yeah, there was someone early on asked a really interesting question, and they crossed out at the end about equal protection in the Constitution, which got my mind churning. But since they said not to ask it, I won't. So the next one is more about the scope. So do the current waivers apply to the entire border, other than the tribal lands, or would there need to be new waivers for additional construction? And yeah, anyone can take that might have a hint on it.
Well, this is Dan. I can just let you know that, to summarize, basically about 500 of the 2,000 U.S.-Mexico border miles were places where laws were waived. And it was done in a somewhat piecemeal fashion. This includes parts of the Tohono O'odham Nation, by the way, as well as other tribal areas, I'm sure. But basically what happened was on 5 separate occasions, former Secretary of Department of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff issued a waiver. Basically, as far as I know, what they do is they issue a statement in the Federal Register saying from this border mile to that border mile, I'm waiving law X, Y, and Z. And they did that first, I might mess this up, someone correct me, but they did that first in the San Diego area with a number of laws. I can get all of the specifics to you, by the way, if anyone wants to have a look at this, I can get you all the specifics. But they started in San Diego, then they waived laws in the area where the Sonoran pronghorn lives in Arizona, and that also included areas in the Tohono O'odham Nation, if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong about that. The third spot where they did it was at the San Pedro, when the Defenders of Wildlife case was brought against the wall construction project and Secretary Chertoff. And then they did something strange where they did sort of an Hidalgo County, Texas waiver, was sort of their 4th one, but that same day they issued what we call the mega waiver, where they basically said, fine, we're sick of doing these smaller waivers, so we're waiving laws for basically everywhere that we might want to build walls for the next few years, and that was the one that brought the total up to nearly 500 miles and 37 laws waived. So that's basically how the waivers were administered, and the way that they look on the ground is that it covers about 1/4 of the overall 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border. I don't have that precisely mapped out for you, but we're working on it. If you want to help with that, let me know. And the extent to which this waivered territory extends into the interior of the United States is undefined. And to my knowledge, the furthest inside the United States that it's been used is about 2 miles inside the line for the so-called Zone 20 road project northwest of Nogales, Arizona. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's great. So we're running up against the end of our time. Fortunately, almost all the questions have been answered so far. For Sarah Krakow from Colorado, with the in the tribal rights, I'm trying to rephrase this question slightly. So with the tribal rights, do those purely apply within the borders of tribal lands, or can any argument be made that those can extend outside those boundaries?
Yeah, good question. Many of the rights that tribes have are limited by their territorial boundaries, but some of them, like the rights to be consulted, could extend to activities that occur outside of tribal boundaries on lands that affect tribal rights, whether it's religious freedom rights or treaty rights, and I'm just talking generally here, not specifically answering the question about Tohono O'odham. So yes, there can be legal rights that tribes have that are distinct from other individuals or groups that extend beyond their territorial boundaries. I think the stronger cases are where actions are taken on tribal land, which is why for both Tohono O'odham and Kickapoo, because they share the border with Mexico, they're in a stronger position than tribes north of the border that just have other kinds of interests that extend beyond their land base.
Great, thanks so much. So final question for everyone. If there's just really briefly one thing you're on the lookout for upcoming here, unanswered question, something that your organization's interested in, you're doing, what would that be? And we'll just go in order of the presenters, starting with Dan.
Well, I already said it, but we're looking to stop the funding for the wall. We think it's a waste of money. This is the most expensive, least effective way to approach border security issues. And we've already paid a heavy price for it down here in the borderlands. So we're looking to reach out to key lawmakers, senators especially, and convince them to vote against any of this billions and billions of dollar border wall funding that we think they're going to be confronted with.
Thanks, Sarah.
Well, I would say the things to look out for are the formation of alliances between, the big national environmental groups like the Sierra Club and the tribes and the tribes' national lobbying organizations like National Congress of American Indians. Often environmental groups, not often and less so recently, but sometimes in the past, environmental groups and tribes have not had the same interests and, have sort of been divided on certain kinds of preservation issues. This could be one, I think, because of the acute effects on tribes, the environmental justice issues, where there could be a very broad coalition, social justice groups, tribes, the big enviros, and maybe the libertarian cost, expenditure hawks all joining together to say this is just a really dumb thing, bad idea, too expensive, and won't solve the problem, just echoing what Dan said. So it would be interesting to see if that kind of coalition would come together.
Thanks. Adding the libertarian groups would truly make it exotic. So that's a fascinating thing to think about. So Andy, you're up.
Yeah, I would watch the appropriation battle. I think that's where this is really going to fight out. And I would really keep my eye on the Republican senators from border states who aren't very enthusiastic about this for a variety of reasons. And I do think there's a strong libertarian pitch that can be made at the same time. My hunch is that the president's going to find it a lot harder to get money for this than he thinks. They may give him some, but they'll nickel and dime it out. But that's where I would go to fight first.
Thanks so much, Andy. And Sarah, batting cleanup.
I would like to echo what the other Sarah said and say that, Earth Justice will be, and I hope that the public broadly will be looking at where this border wall impacts people and the kind of coalitions that can be brought together around that. The movement around Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline has been hugely powerful. And to the extent that this is a fight that is going to be possibly primarily political and secondarily legal, I think that having the power of that kind of movement behind it will be extremely important.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And thanks to all the panelists, thanks to all the attendees. You guys are great. We'll be having a lot more of these throughout the next couple of years. Please email me, David Roach, roach@eli.org, if you have suggestions. You can even suggest whole panels. I want to be a conduit for what you guys want to hear about. So thanks to everyone. There's a survey on your way out. Shoot me any suggestions you have. You can also get my email. And yeah, we really appreciate your time and hope you all have an amazing day. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, David.
Thanks. Bye-bye.